She called her neighbor a cruel name at 83 and expected everyone to just sit there and take it. She called her neighbor a fat ass. Right there at the dinner table. On Mother's Day. And then when someone finally said something, she looked that person dead in the eye and said she was 83 years old and could call anyone whatever she wanted. That was the moment. That was the sentence that changed the entire evening. Because here is the thing. That kind of response is not an accident. That is a declaration. She was not embarrassed, she was not caught off guard, she did not fumble or backtrack. She doubled down with total confidence and basically announced to the room that her age was now a license to be cruel to people. There was no hesitation in her voice, no flicker of shame crossing her face, no instinct to soften what she had just said. She sat there at the head of that table, surrounded by her family on a day specifically set aside to honor mothers, and she chose cruelty and then chose to defend it. And the person on the receiving end of that declaration picked up her shoes and walked right out the door. Let's go back to the beginning here because context matters a lot in this one. The mother-in-law had spent over 40 years as part of this neighborhood. 40 years of friendships, 40 years of being woven into the fabric of that street and those relationships. 40 years of borrowing sugar and waving from driveways and showing up to block parties and knowing which neighbor kept a spare key and which one had a dog that barked every Thursday morning. By all accounts, she was someone people knew and trusted. A fixture. The kind of woman younger neighbors respected because she had simply been there so long that her presence felt permanent. Then her husband passed away and something shifted. Something changed in how she moved through the world and how she spoke about the people around her. The warmth did not disappear overnight, but it curdled slowly, quietly, in ways that were probably easy to excuse at first and increasingly impossible to ignore. Now, the original poster was very clear about something important. This is not a dementia situation. She made a point of adding that note because she knew people would go there and she wanted to cut it off. Her own mother had dementia and she watched firsthand how that disease can slowly reshape a person's personality in ways that are heartbreaking and not within their control. She knows what that looks like. She has sat in the specific grief of watching someone she loves become someone she does not recognize. She has seen the confusion and the fear and the moments of terrible clarity that make it even harder to bear. She knows the difference between a mind that is slipping and a mind that has simply decided certain rules no longer apply to it. This is not that. This is something else entirely. This is a woman who has decided that reaching a certain age means the rules no longer apply to her. That is a choice. A deliberate, conscious, repeated choice. Not a symptom. Not a side effect of grief or age or loneliness. A choice that gets made every single time she opens her mouth to speak about another person and decides that kindness is optional and accountability is something that applies to everyone younger than her. And the name-calling was not a one-time slip. The original poster had already spoken to her about it before. More than once. She had raised it calmly, the way you do when you are trying to preserve a relationship while also standing up for something that matters. She had explained why it was hurtful, why the words landed hard even when the target was not in the room, why repeating them at a dinner table normalized something that had no business being normalized. She had asked her to stop. She had done this more than once and she had done it knowing it was going to be uncomfortable and that the mother-in-law was unlikely to respond the way a reasonable person would. She kept trying anyway because that is what people do when they are still extending good faith to someone they are supposed to love as family. And each time the mother-in-law had apparently continued anyway, as if the conversation had never happened, as if the concern had evaporated the moment it left the room. So by the time that Mother's Day dinner rolled around, this was not a new conversation. This was the latest chapter in an ongoing pattern that had been happening for a while. So when the original poster brought it up again at the table, she was not overreacting to a first offense. She was responding to a repeated behavior from someone who had already been told multiple times that this was not okay. She had done everything the reasonable playbook asks you to do. She had communicated. She had been patient. She had given the benefit of the doubt more times than most people would. And the mother-in-law's response to being called out this particular time was not to apologize, not to acknowledge the impact, not to even pretend to consider changing. She went straight to the age card. 83 years old, and I will call anyone whatever I want. That was her entire answer. Let that sink in for a second. That was the whole argument. My age means I get to be unkind and no one is allowed to say anything about it. The original poster did not argue back. She did not escalate. She did not raise her voice or make a scene or slam anything down on the table. She sat with that response for a moment, long enough to understand exactly what it meant and exactly what it was telling her about how this was going to go if she stayed. And then she quietly picked up her shoes, which she had removed as required by the household rules, and she walked out. There is something almost poetic about that image. Even in the act of leaving, she respected the customs of the house. She followed the rules on her way out the door. She was composed. She was dignified. She left without giving the situation more heat than it had already generated on its own. And then the mother-in-law followed her outside, asking her to come back. Which is fascinating and worth sitting with for a moment. Because just 1 minute earlier she had been completely unrepentant, completely confident in her right to say whatever she wanted to whoever she wanted for whatever reason she decided was sufficient. She had announced it like a proclamation. But the moment there was an actual consequence, the moment someone actually stood up and physically removed herself from the room, suddenly she wanted the person back. That tells you a lot. That tells you almost everything. People who genuinely believe they have done nothing wrong do not chase someone down a driveway asking them to return. They sit back down and finish their meal. The fact that she went after her means somewhere underneath that 83-year-old certainty, she understood that something real had just happened. That the usual tools, the dismissal, the deflection, the age card, had not worked this time the way they always had before. Then the husband did something that deserves recognition. He said he did not blame his wife and he followed her out. On Mother's Day. At his own mother's house. That took something real. That was a husband standing at a crossroads where a lot of people would have stalled or tried to split the difference, pulled in two directions by loyalty and love and the particular guilt that comes with walking away from a parent. Instead, he chose clearly and quickly. He chose his partner. He chose to validate her experience instead of minimizing it, to tell her with his feet and his presence that she had not overreacted, that what she had done was right, that she did not have to stand alone in this. He chose to stand behind her decision even when it meant walking away from his own mother on a holiday that is specifically about honoring her. He did not try to smooth things over, did not try to play both sides and keep everyone comfortable while nothing changed. He made a choice and he followed through on it, and that kind of clarity in a moment like that is not as common as it should be. Now here is where it gets more complicated. The mother-in-law has 3 sons. And all 3 of them apparently allow this behavior to continue without pushback, without consequence, without anyone sitting her down and making her feel that there were actual limits to what was acceptable. They have never collectively drawn a line. They have let it slide or laughed along or changed the subject or told themselves it was just how she was and there was nothing to be done about it. And that silence over years and years taught her something very specific. It told her this was acceptable. It told her she could keep going. It told her that the people who loved her most would not hold her accountable, and that belief became the air she breathed inside those family dinners. The behavior did not appear out of nowhere. It was cultivated, slowly, in a family environment where no one ever made the cost of it real enough to matter. The original poster is the one who kept trying to push back. She did it knowing it was uncomfortable, knowing she was the outlier in a family that had already made its peace with the behavior. She did it again on Mother's Day. And this time, instead of just being ignored or dismissed or silently endured, she removed herself entirely from the situation. She did not demand that the mother-in-law change. She did not issue an ultimatum or threaten consequences or make it a screaming match. She simply decided she was not going to sit there and absorb it anymore, and she acted on that decision with complete quiet. There is a real difference between those two things that is worth examining. Trying to control what someone else says is exhausting and usually pointless, especially when that person has had 3 sons and 40 years of social reinforcement telling her that she is fine exactly as she is. But deciding what you are willing to be present for is entirely within your power. The original poster found the version of this situation that she actually had control over, and she acted on it. She cannot stop an 83-year-old woman from being cruel. But she can stop herself from being in the room while it happens. That distinction, between trying to change another person and simply protecting yourself from them, is one that takes most people years to learn. She had clearly learned it. The neighbor being called that name has done nothing to deserve it. She is just a woman living on a street where someone who used to be her friend has decided to reduce her to an insult, to flatten her entire existence into a dismissive cruelty that gets repeated at dinner tables she will never sit at. She probably has no idea this is what she is being called behind her back, going about her life completely unaware that somewhere nearby a woman who once knew her as a neighbor and a friend has quietly decided that this is what she amounts to. Or maybe she does know, and it has been quietly hurting her for months, that low steady ache of knowing someone who once smiled at you across a fence now speaks about you that way to her family. Either way, she deserves better than that. She deserves to be more than a punchline in someone else's living room. She deserves to walk down her own street without being the subject of a cruelty she has no opportunity to defend herself against. And the original poster deserves not to have to sit through it every time she visits. Here is where things land. The mother-in-law is not confused. She is not unwell. She is not grieving in a way that excuses cruelty toward people who have never done anything to her. She is a woman who made a conscious decision that her age freed her from basic decency, and she has made that decision so many times now that it no longer feels like a decision to her. It just feels like her personality. And the original poster made an equally conscious decision that she was not going to validate that belief by staying at the table. This was not an overreaction. This was a boundary drawn after years of patience. 3 sons who never pushed back trained that woman to believe there were no limits. The original poster was the only person in that house who consistently said this is not okay, and when words stopped working she used the only other tool she had, which was her presence, and she took it away. She is not the asshole here. Not even close. She was patient. She was measured. She gave multiple chances. And when she left she did so quietly and without drama. If anything, the only regret here should be that it took this long for someone to actually leave. Misael has been blaming her son's bad behavior on autism for years, and I finally said something. An 11-year-old boy has spent most of his childhood with every difficult moment in his life explained away by a diagnosis that 2 out of 3 doctors did not even believe he had. And for 8 years the one person in the family who had real doubts kept her mouth shut. Until one afternoon she finally said something about an iPad. And everything exploded. This one is layered. There are a lot of moving parts here, and it is worth slowing down to understand each of them before rushing to any kind of conclusion. Because on the surface this looks like a straightforward story about someone speaking up about a parenting choice. But underneath it is actually a story about something much more uncomfortable, which is what happens when someone has built an entire identity around a story that might not be fully true. The original poster has known this nephew since he was 3 years old. She was there early, present for birthday parties and Sunday dinners and lazy afternoons where you get to see a child just being themselves without any performance attached to it. She had the chance to observe him before any label was attached in her mind, before she had a framework built for him, and her honest impression even then was that something felt off about the diagnosis. Not that he did not need support, not that nothing was going on with him, but that autism specifically did not match what she was seeing. He was chatty and curious and made strong eye contact and seemed to read the room in ways that surprised her. She kept that thought to herself for years because she knew the spectrum was wide and she did not want to overstep on something she might be wrong about. That is actually a thoughtful and self-aware position to take. She acknowledged her own limitations as someone who is not a clinician and does not have professional training. She did not go running to the sister-in-law with her amateur opinion the moment it formed. She sat with the discomfort of not knowing. She watched and she waited and she gave it time, hoping that either the diagnosis would start to make more sense to her or that she would find a way to make peace with the uncertainty of it. And then over the years the sister-in-law started saying things that made those doubts harder to ignore. She talked about fighting the first pediatrician to even get a test done, framing it as a battle she had to wage just to be taken seriously as a mother. She mentioned that the first 2 doctors who tested the boy said they did not see signs of autism, that what they observed was more consistent with a speech delay and some behavioral patterns that could be addressed with therapy and time. It was only the 3rd doctor who said there might be something slight on the spectrum. 1 out of 3. And even that one used the word might. But that is not the version of the story that goes on Facebook. On Facebook it is the full narrative. The struggles of raising a child with autism. The challenges. The advocacy. The exhaustion. The posts that position her as a mother fighting a hard battle while parenting a child with significant needs. There is a community there, followers who respond with heart emojis and comments about how strong she is, and that community is built on a version of events that is presented as far more definitive than the actual medical record would suggest. Okay, I am just going to say what everyone is thinking here. When someone has to go through 3 doctors to get the answer they were looking for and then presents that answer as a settled and undeniable fact while leaving out the 2 doctors who disagreed, that is not just an interpretation of a medical situation. That is shaping a story. And when every single difficulty the child experiences, every bad grade, every tantrum, every addiction to a screen that the parents handed him, all gets filed under the same one diagnosis, something starts to feel less like advocacy and more like a system that works very well for the adults involved. It removes the need for self-examination. It closes the door on any question that might feel too uncomfortable to sit with. And it does that at the expense of a child who is growing up being told that his struggles are fixed and permanent rather than things he might actually be able to work through. The boy is 11 now. He has had an iPad since he was 4. That is 7 years of unregulated screen time, 7 years of a glowing rectangle being the primary way he self-soothes and passes time and exists in moments that feel boring or hard. You can picture it clearly enough. A small kid on a couch, headphones on, completely unreachable, and every adult in the room treating that image as something inevitable rather than something constructed. And the parents have attributed his dependence on that device to his autism rather than to the environment they created around him. The original poster made a very specific point about this. She did not go after the autism diagnosis directly in this moment. She targeted the specific claim, which was that iPad addiction is a symptom of autism, and she said that is not how it works. Lots of kids will develop that kind of dependency if nobody sets limits. That is not a radical or even controversial statement. It is something pediatricians and child development researchers say openly and consistently. But it landed like a grenade. The room shifted. You can imagine the silence that followed, the kind that feels louder than shouting, where everyone at the table suddenly becomes very interested in their food. The sister-in-law heard it as an attack on her entire identity as a mother. Because in a way it was, even if that was not the intention. When someone's whole story depends on a particular explanation being true, even the smallest challenge to any piece of that explanation can feel like the whole structure is being threatened. The diagnosis is not just a medical label at this point. It is the load-bearing wall of how she understands her life, her sacrifices, and her sense of herself as someone doing something heroic and hard. Pull one brick and she feels the whole thing shaking. And to be fair to the sister-in-law, being challenged by your brother's wife on how you are raising your disabled child is not a comfortable experience regardless of the circumstances. The power dynamics alone are complicated without adding years of quiet tension underneath it all. The original poster apologized immediately. She said she was sorry if she had caused pain. But she also did not take back the substance of what she had said, because she believed it was true. And the husband privately agreed with her. He just thought she should have kept it to himself, which is its own kind of complicated. Because agreeing privately while staying silent publicly is how this situation has been managed for 8 years already, and that has not exactly resolved anything. And that is the real tension at the center of this story. Not just whether she was right about the diagnosis or the iPad, but whether someone had an obligation to say something at all. She had been watching this child grow up for 8 years. She had watched a pattern develop where nothing was ever his responsibility, nothing was ever a result of parenting choices, everything was always the diagnosis. And she wondered what that does to a kid over time. What does it teach him about himself when every hard thing gets explained away before he even has a chance to push through it? What does it teach him about cause and effect and accountability when the adults around him are so committed to a single explanation that no other explanation is ever allowed to exist? That is not a small concern. That is actually a concern that centers the child. Here is where the verdict lands on this one. The original poster was right about the iPad comment on its factual merits. She was right that iPad addiction is not an autism symptom and that parental limits matter regardless of what else is going on with a kid. She was also right, in her private assessment, to have doubts about how the diagnosis has been used over the years. But the way this all came out was not designed for impact. It came out sideways, in a heated moment, aimed at a specific excuse rather than at the actual heart of the concern. If she wanted to actually make a difference for this child, a private conversation with the husband first, building a shared approach, might have opened a door. Instead, it became a confrontation that the sister-in-law could close by framing it as an attack, and now the whole topic is probably more off-limits than it was before. The original poster is not the asshole. She did not say anything cruel. She did not accuse anyone of lying outright. She challenged a specific claim with a reasonable counterpoint. But she is also dealing with a situation that is genuinely complicated, one that involves a child, a diagnosis, a family dynamic, and years of built-up tension, and a dinner table is not the place where any of that actually gets resolved. The child at the center of all of this is the one who matters most. And right now the people who could advocate for him having real structure, real accountability, and a genuine understanding of who he actually is, are stuck in an argument about who is allowed to have an opinion. That is the real loss here. Because that kid deserves better than being a story someone tells on Facebook. He deserves someone to figure out what he actually needs and then actually give it to him. Drop a comment below telling me which story hit harder for you. And if you are new here, a like and a subscribe would genuinely mean a lot.